Hi, everyone. This is Evelyn Lim, and welcome to another episode of Heard on West Exec, the podcast about everything you need to know about working in the federal executive branch. And today I'm really excited to have our guest, Chad Wolf, who was the former acting Secretary of Homeland Security, on the podcast with us. Welcome, Chad.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you've had, I should probably tell everyone that you were my first boss in the federal executive branch, and that was at the TSA. And not a lot of people can say this, but you were one of the first people at TSA when it was created in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. So tell me a little bit about how you got into TSA and what your career path was up to that point.
Yeah, I think my claim to fame is hiring Evelyn Lim, so it's great. No, look, I was working on Capitol Hill during the attacks of 9/11. Obviously, had a pretty strong impact on myself at the time, and obviously what would become my career. Um, Shortly after 9/11, Congress, as you indicated, passed legislation that created the Transportation Security Administration, and they did that in November of 2001. TSA didn't stand up until January, February of 2002, and I became an employee in April of '02. So pretty early on. I think it was number 200 employee. Um, was a pseudo political appointee at the time. It was during the Bush administration, and they were just trying to find people to go in there and help. And so I did that and started working there. And we brought in good people like Evelyn, like yourself, and others that wanted to make a difference after 9/11, wanted to serve their country in a unique way. And joining TSA was, it was like a startup, basically at that point in time, kind of the newest federal agency in decades. And so there's a lot of learning pains in doing that. But at the age, I think I was probably around 25 ish, 26 maybe, when I was doing that. So it was quite an experience.
So I don't think a lot of people can talk about setting up a new agency. There's got to be a lot of challenges with that, and on this podcast we talk a lot about the mechanics and the process of it. And so, talk a little bit about some of the things that you were thinking about when you were setting up a new agency process wise.
Well, you do everything for the first time, right? So usually when you walk into an organization or a company of some kind, they give you a big, manual of here's how we do this and here's how we do that. And that just wasn't the case with TSA. It was sort of we're making it up as we go. Particularly, I worked in the policy office, so really coming out with new and security policy after 9/11, it was a game changer. And so really trying to organize all of that and how you were interrelated and worked with airlines and airports and other stakeholders. We made it up as we went, and we got a lot of it right. We got some of it wrong from time to time. But the challenge I saw really at that time was, you know, having not been in that aviation security environment for 10 or 20 years, like some of our colleagues there at the time, is just trying to you're not only starting a new agency, but you're also working with a new group of individuals for the first time as well, right? A lot of them came from either the Secret Service or from FAA or other elements of the federal government. And then there was a subset of folks that were new to federal service or came in with the Bush administration. And so we're trying to build an agency and then build a leadership team all at the same time. And so there were some real challenges to doing that. But I think the best part was, for the most part, everyone was there for the right reason. They felt personally impacted by 9/11, and so you had a lot of long days, a lot of long nights, and a lot of long weekends to stand TSA up. For the most part, if I were to look back on 2002 through 2005 during my tenure there, I'm pretty proud of what we did. Like I said, we didn't get it all right, but we were able to federalize over 450 airports, roll out a lot of security technology, that you see out in the airports today. And I think even though there's a little bit of a hassle factor, right? Certainly after 9/11, and probably continues to this day to a certain extent. I think that the telling sign is we've never really had another major incident in the aviation system since.
And one of the interesting things for me, because I, as you know, went from TSA and I've gone to other federal agencies and departments at HUD, and I was at worked in the State Department for a small bit and also in the White House, was that I always had assumed, just coming from TSA, that how you do process, how you execute on policies is the same throughout the federal government. But really, it's not. And I think one of the great things about TSA and Homeland Security, particularly, was that you weren't bogged down by some of the decades, really, of this is just how we do things. This is you really could think about it from the standpoint of, if we were going to create something today,
Yep.
how do we want to do it, and what is the most effective way to do it? So that was, I thought, something really interesting about working at Homeland Security. And one of the things I think we benefited from enormously.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I kind of, I would then take that and flash forward to, service during the Trump administration. And even though a lot of those agencies are established, you had leadership coming from the chief executive saying, why do we do it that way? And you had a little bit of a commander's intent to say, if you need to break it up and do something different for the American people, go ahead and do it. So I think that's an interesting point. You can kind of see how it was after a very big event like 9/11, and then see how it's very similar when you have a very different and chief executive in the White House.
And I think important to look at it from that outsider view
Yep.
of, why on earth are we doing it this way if we can do it better? And that is, I think, something about having kind of leadership with experience outside of the government. But you had come from the Hill, you mentioned. How did that prepare you for going into the executive?
Yeah, so a lot of what you do on the Hill is a little bit policy oriented and policy based. So it was, how do you research? How do you write briefing memos? How do you prepare a principal? How do you give them talking points? How do you make the pitch that you're making a very succinct way? And a lot of what I did on the Hill then translated to TSA as I went into the policy office there is, how do you how do you draw all these very complex policy, security policy regime into something that the American people can really understand very simply? And so just kind of taking legislation on the Hill, boiling it down for a principal, in my case, a senator, I think that actually helped very well. I think you've got to be aware of your surroundings. You got to understand who your principals are, who your bosses are, who are the stakeholders, whether you're on the Hill or you're at TSA or a federal agency. You always need to talk and write with that audience in mind. And so I think that was the biggest takeaway I had from Capitol Hill, whether I'm writing to a constituent living in Texas or wherever. And then how did I translate that to, how do we talk to the American people about an aviation security regime that they've never been through before, and the reasons for it. So I think in some ways I was prepared very well for that. In other ways, not well at all, right? Having to do something so monumental after a very big event in the life of our country, that there were a lot of things you just couldn't prepare for either.
So fast forward to coming back into
Yep.
DHS and TSA, and we hear a lot about the beachhead teams. Can you talk a little bit about what those are, and what you're doing as part of that beachhead in the early days of an administration?
Sure. So you have the formal transition effort that kicks off, prior to a November election, and then certainly after the November election if the candidate wins. So you have a transition team who will then decide for every agency and every department, they will start putting together what we call a beachhead team. And these are a group or a group of individuals that will go into a department. We'll talk about DHS that will go into DHS really on minute one of day one, right? As the president's getting sworn in and on the east side, west side of the Capitol, I think. Yeah, west side of the Capitol. As he's taking the oath of office, 30 seconds later, that beachhead team is taking the oath of office at DHS headquarters, or at least that was the case in 2017 when I was there. And so they're there and they spread out throughout the department, trying to get a sense of what's going on, what are the major decisions that need to be made. And then they're ultimately there to implement the president's agenda, or at least to start, right? The beachhead is, you're going to take the beach, right? You're going to be the first ones on site there to understand what's going on. And then as the larger political team of that administration comes in, they start building out those different departments with many more folks, many more political appointees and others. But the beachhead teams, it's an interesting and unique way. It's usually the first one into an agency or a department from the new administration. So depending on where you are, a lot of people are interested in what you have to say, and others don't want to hear anything about what you have to say. So you have to build up goodwill on your own, and you've got to figure out how to relate to these folks and talk to them and make sure that everyone knows you're on the same team. You just may have a different set of agenda and perspective on it. So for me, it was fascinating. I wasn't on the transition, but I guess you would say I was on the beachhead because I was there on day one in 2017 at the department.
So you mentioned that there's a few of you that spread out throughout the
Yep.
department, and DHS is one of the largest agencies. I think the third largest, over 260,000 employees by I think last count. How big is the beachhead team for say DHS, and how how do you actually figure out who's doing what?
Yeah, that's a great question. For us at DHS, you had about, if fully staffed with political appointees, probably around 130 to 150. That's quite a bit for one agency and one department. But I think on day one in 2017, there was only about 20 of us. So you can see you didn't have your full force of political appointees going in. Um, and really the transition team works out where you go. So before you even arrive, they kind of have an idea of where they want people to go. Someone will go to TSA, someone will go to ICE, someone will go to CBP, all different agencies within the department. And it was only one person could go to one agency. We just didn't have that many people. So for myself, I was the only one at TSA at the time on day one. Um, and there were others spread throughout the organization as well. But that's something that the transition team does. And then you go in there and you've got to kind of figure it out as you go and, rely on folks up at the department and the White House to say, okay, here's the president's agenda. That's why the transition team is so important, because presumably they start building out what the president wants to see happen in these agencies and departments. And then so when you get there as a beachhead member, hopefully you don't have to make it up. Hopefully you have a manual or a briefing book that says, here's what, the president wants to accomplish here, in the first 30 days, 60, 90, 120 days. So that's kind of your Bible, more or less, all right, for your time there in the office, and you get to work on that.
So you essentially were part of the Trump administration for the whole 4 years, starting at TSA and then ultimately becoming acting secretary of the department. And, we mentioned how big DHS actually is. And just, I don't know if everyone recognizes how diverse the mission is. Everything from Secret Service to Coast Guard to TSA, Customs and Border Protection, and then, you know, everything in between. How as a secretary, do you deal with the challenges of managing such a large and diverse enterprise?
Yeah, it was tough. For me, I think I had a ringside seat as being an acting chief of staff and then a chief of staff for two different, well, one was an acting secretary, one was a secretary. So I did have some time sort of, in the seat here a little bit to understand how the department worked for about 2.5 years before I became acting secretary. So I think that gave me a unique perspective on the challenges and how do you manage, as you indicated, not only a diverse workforce, right, that's spread throughout the country, here in DC, but also throughout the country, but also a diverse mission set. As you indicated, you could go from dealing with a very complex cyber event that's in real time to a Coast Guard to emergency management to TSA to CBP to ICE to Secret Service, right? All different mission sets. And a lot of people like to equate DHS to DoD, and just from the sheer size and obviously the security mission. But as I say, usually DoD they have a common adversary. They just attack that adversary four different ways using the different services. DHS has different adversaries. We have different mission sets and different missions to do. So really, really complex. I think for me, during my time as acting secretary, it really helps to have a good leadership team, a team that's on the same agenda that you can because you have to give them latitude to go out and execute their job. And if you have to look over their shoulder every minute of every day, it's never going to work. So I had a pretty good leadership team there. Um, but even then, you still have to know so much about the department. When I would go testify on our budget, as you know, Evelyn, that budget is not small at DHS. And so you had to know, Coast Guard budget to TSA's budget. What was their capital expenditure? What were their capital investments? What were the grants that so it was actually a very, very overwhelming. Again, the fact that I had been at the department for several years prior to that, I think helped not only build a knowledge base up, but also help, like, I knew what I needed to know and I knew what, I wasn't expected to know. I wasn't expected to know every element of every budget line or everything about everything going on at DHS. You have to pick and choose what you spend your time on. And that only comes with experience and with a good group of people around you that can help you prioritize.
So that brings me to the question of putting your team together. And what do you look for? What skill set, what qualities do you look for in both your leadership team and the team that you put together for Homeland?
Yeah, so it's a variety of different things, right? You need different qualities for different leaders and leadership. I think first and foremost, you're looking for folks that have some knowledge base of that agency. So, right, if you're looking for someone to go in and to lead FEMA, well, they need emergency management experience, right? You don't need someone that's going into an agency that doesn't know anything about it, doesn't know anything about the mission or anything else. So I think that's important. You need a leader. You need to make sure that you're hiring someone that can lead a team, a large team in many cases at DHS. You need to make sure that you have someone that people can get along with, that they like. If no one, if someone's, not going to be a team player, no one's going to listen to them, then it doesn't matter who's there. And then I think, probably most importantly, you've got to be able to trust that individual. And they have to be able to trust you. And so everything I just said seems fairly easy, seems commonplace, common sense. It's actually very hard to find. You usually pick up one or two or maybe three of those traits, but not all four. And so we had some hiccups along the way, but I think most folks, particularly that last year, at least when I was acting secretary, we got the right team on the field. And everyone was moving in the right direction. I think that's why you saw a lot of progress, even though it was a very difficult year with COVID and civil unrest and immigration and a lot of things going on that last year. I think that's where we saw a lot of the results of the Trump administration.
Great. So we're coming on to the end of our podcast here, and something that we ask all of our guests is, what advice would you give to somebody who was looking to join the federal executive branch, maybe at Homeland Security or in the national security field?
Yeah, particularly if it's well, it depends, right? If you're super young and if you're just trying to start your career, I think that's a different set of advice versus someone who's a little bit later in their career and wants to join the federal government and give back one way or another. But I think regardless of those two, I think you've got to have a burning desire to serve, right? You've got to be willing to do that because there's going to be long days, difficult issues. Now you'll get compensated, right? But you're not going to be wealthy coming from a federal government standpoint. So you've got to understand that, and I think the trade-off there is the service that you're providing, and obviously, if you get to do some very interesting work along the way there, that's also beneficial. So I think that desire to serve has got to be there, and if it's not, you might be selling yourself short at the end of the day. I think that's probably one of the most impactful things. I think the other, if you're very young in your career and you're joining the federal government, I meet a lot of young folks. I think what I would tell them is be flexible. You don't. It's very difficult to plan your career out more than 4 years, right? You can have an idea of where you want to go, what agency you want to work in, the kind of subject matter expertise that you want to deal with. But then after that, be flexible. If it takes you left or right or up or down, just roll with it. There's a lot of young folks today that I talk to that want to plan their career 5, 10, 15 years out. And I haven't seen that be really successful in DC and in the federal government.
Well, that was some great advice. And I wanted to thank you so much, Chad, for joining us on Heard on West Exec. It is the weekly podcast from the American Cornerstone Institute's Executive Branch for America program. Remember to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube on our YouTube channel. Until then, we'll see you next week.